Okay, it's 2 o'clock. I'm Mark Strickland, and I'll just give you a little bit of background. I guess I like to joke occasionally that I've been in computers since BC, before computers. That's how old I am. I did a lot of work way back when there was really not much. Everybody remember Data Point?
Oh yeah.
Okay, yeah, all right. So did a lot of stuff in assembler there because that's all you didn't have many tools to do some of this stuff. But
worse than that, I bought stock in it.
oh yeah, okay. Did you make any money?
No.
No, okay. And just been around a long time. Did a lot of Power Basic development back in the day. I guess Basic is kind of my preferred dialect of languages and things. And then I had tinkered with Real Basic along the way and never got real serious at it until web apps. And that's I'm doing now just almost exclusively new stuff anyway. Do some maintenance on old things, but exclusively new things in Xojo, making web apps, and have in the last few years started out with an app that has evolved, and that was sort of where this came from. The title has been a little bit changed. I wanted to have looking for code in all the wrong places, inspired by the urban cowboy song, looking for love in all the wrong places, but somehow we changed these things to be more international flavor, I guess. Looking didn't seem to work for them. So anyway, searching for code, and it was sort of inspired because I kept running into problems in this app and just couldn't find stuff. And so that's how we kind of got started. This is really not a technical presentation. It'll be about sort of inspiring you to come up with something to get a little more formal on how you maybe do things. It is the perspective from a one-person shop. Me, the MacGyver guy, you know, I'm very much prone to doing MacGyver kinds of things that don't lend itself to formal procedures, because you just make something work today and you think you'll fix it later and you don't, and then you're haunted by it. And I'm also pretty much a procedural-oriented programmer kind of guy. I don't do tons of object stuff. I did sit in on Mark Zeter's presentation earlier today. That was pretty good. And I guess I'm inspired to maybe try to do that more often. So, has this ever happened to you? You started a large project without a formal design. Anybody ever do that? Did you ever start a small project that turned into a large project? Have you ever, after a while, you work on it and it's like, I can't even remember the name of the form of the screen or the whatever, and you just can't find it again. And you do eventually find it. So this is about talking about ways that you might be able to solve that problem. Properties in screens seem to hide. No source code control per se. Maybe you do backups, but now you got an oops in the middle of the day and it's like, oh crap, I got to roll back to last night's backup I did before I went to bed. And so how do we handle that? But in a one-person shop, is Git source code control really efficient? Yes. Okay. The last screen you added doesn't look like the first. The colors are different. You know, the OK button or the submit button is green on the first few screens, and then you get to the end and it's some other color after you add a couple of years later when you add a screen. And so you just have this flavor that has changed over time. Too busy to comment your code? That ever happen? Okay. These are things aspirin won't fix. So you have to have some sort of strategy. So this is about trying to be a little more strategic.
Can I ask a quick question?
Sure.
Related to what they just said about the source control, in a one-man shop, why is going through something like Git more efficient than is bringing a backup of your project?
We'll talk about that. I've got a slide or two. We'll talk about that. There are reasons that backup isn't as interesting, and one of the biggest reasons would be something really gets screwed up at 4 o'clock in the afternoon and you've spent a whole day developing, and the only way to get back there is last night's backup. So that's not
true with Git too.
Well, it depends. It depends how you use Git. It also would depend on what I do is a different solution. It's source code control, but because I'm a one-person shop developer, I get the best of both worlds, that it happens automatically, and we'll talk about that. So this won't be about all the answers. This will be about things to sort of say, oh yeah, we talked about that, but maybe that doesn't fit me, but gee, now I've got a new idea to think about, so you chase that idea down and make it work for you in maybe some other way. So we're going to talk about consistency. That's part of the problem when you go looking for that screen if you named them different. I mean, it's like you put the functional name in the front versus the functional name in the back or some other way, and your naming conventions become kind of disjointed, and looking for things becomes a problem because you can't search for them very well unless you search for only the piece of it, and then maybe you'll find it. So simplification, that you have this drive to write the most elegant code, and you do things that get really convoluted and complicated, but you can't understand it later. So sometimes it's kind of like data normalization in a database. I mean, third normal is what you ought to do, but sometimes it's just not always the best way to do it. So I'm a pragmatic kind of guy. I mean, I probably could never work at a big shop. They would just throw me out after about a day. So, and I don't want to throw out some things that, in terms of looking for code and things while you're working on a project, that just dumb little simple things that I have done that might help, that might jog an idea in your own mind. So you need to make this your style and strategy. This isn't about me having all the right answers. This is about me jogging something in your brain that says, yeah, I could do that, and I'll do it my way and make it work. And then the trick is it takes discipline. So you come up with a plan and then you abandon it because you're in a hurry. That doesn't do you any good, because you probably have lots of little plans running around in your head, better ways to do things, but you got to have the discipline to make it happen. So consistency. A lot of projects start small and grow over time. You need some sort of design plan. I mean, and different projects might take a different design plan, or you might just have a common template design plan, like all the commit buttons ought to be green, I don't know, or whatever works for you. Or maybe different customer you might be working with would say, no, I don't like green, I want them blue. But at least you document that, so as you go through this, and some of the documentation in a small shop, it might be just to write it down makes you remember a year later that, yeah, the button has to be green. So you just need some sort of design plan, and if nothing else, it's just a one page of bullets that say this, 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 and this. And it probably should evolve over time. Because the problems creep in because you're pressed for time, you don't remember that the button should be green, and you end up doing something different, and then somebody in the user community says, why is it on this screen that it works that way? User interface design, you do different things because, and here's one of the things I'm guilty of. When I first started doing web apps, I didn't have any way for an easy message box, so I built one out of a dialog box. So, and it got kind of kludgy after a while because I kept wanting to do different things, and I didn't really think about that very well in the beginning. And then I stumbled across Graffiti Suite, which does these really nice pop-up message boxes. So now I have an app that I'm in the process of going back and changing over all the others. But the user interface has this sort of different flavor depending on where you are in it because of things that have evolved. And have evolved for the better. They evolved because I like Graffiti Suite. You may not like it, but it does. I thought it did a really cool job of dialog boxes, pop-up message boxes in a web app. And you basically a line of code makes you a nice, pretty message box, and it's pretty consistent. Coding style, that can evolve over time, your personal style, but you need to do things, try to come up with something and be consistent. And there's a lot of little silly things that about being consistent we'll talk about in a second. Object naming, again, that's about, well, should I put the keyword of the function first, or should I put some other piece of the keyword there? So if you just come up with a strategy and stick it in your head, whatever makes sense to you, doesn't really matter how the object name is constructed, but just so long as it makes sense in your brain. So, and the thing you shouldn't do is come up with standards that are artificial if you can help it. If your brain thinks a certain way, well, just go ahead and take advantage of that and do it that way. Database design is the same thing. Again, the third normal is what you should do, but maybe sometimes you don't. Column names should probably match up with something that makes sense rather than WK1, WK2, or other things that you probably don't do much, but you probably need to think about that and make sure that in your database design you're doing the same kind of consistency. And do it the same in every project if you can. If there's not some other standard that says, well, you're working for this customer, they demand I have it this way, and you're working for another customer or a different department or whatever, then try to apply these principles across the board, because then when you go back and forth between projects, it'll all make sense again. If you can't because you're forced to, well, that's back at that every project needs a design document, so you take your design document and transmogrify it into the other customer's version of it, and just be sure and follow that as you go. I'm not a big guy on documentation, but if you just write down the basics and stick it somewhere, you can refer back to it. So consistency is user interface design. I mean, the green button thing, or you always use a certain font. Don't bounce around among fonts. Don't do, how you edit fields should be as consistent as possible. Colors, be consistent across all the screens. And so if you had that little design document, you'd know 2 years later when you're adding this new dialog box that it's like, oh yeah, I got to make the background this color and I want this way. Controls, the graffiti suite problem. You can do things one way. If you're going to change the way you're going to do it, you probably need to go back and take some time to retrofit stuff. Otherwise, users look at it and they just don't. It kind of becomes amateurish and makes it hard for them to use it over time. So if you're selling it, that's probably a real negative side effect. If it's something in an internal department, they just put up with it because those dumb IT guys do whatever. Navigation, in terms of just getting around the program. Use the same kind of technique on how you get from place to place, whether you're using buttons or clickable labels or whatever you're doing. Think about that so that the user has a consistent experience, if it makes sense. Now, there may be cases that it doesn't make sense, because on this web app I've built, there is a mobile web page to it, and if you log in and your user ID is for this mobile user, it presents a whole new interface, and it has its own navigation. It doesn't match the rest of the project, but the rest of the project matches, not totally, but I wish it did, and it'll get there eventually, but it should match. Use of dialogues and web pages and screens if you're in a web app. I like the slide down dialogues, the sheet pages, because that makes it really consistent, and I try to do that. And sometimes that gets a little funky, but I have a couple of apps, a couple of places in this one giant app. There's a sheet dialog, and another sheet dialog comes down over top of that. So, but I try to make it consistent so the user doesn't have to contend with things that pop up and act different in different ways. Third-party controls, the graffiti suite. They can make a lot of consistency for you if you use them, or you develop your own little thing and you consistently use it. So you ought to consider probably a template to start a new project that basically has the standard colors and the standard whatevers you have in it, and create some sort of template that can sort of get you started. It's also your memory jogger, so you don't have to go back to the documentation, which nobody likes to read that stuff anyway, right? Coding style should include things like, I'm a really bad guy because I came from such old things as GW Basic. Is that what it was? Microsoft's interpreted Basic way back when. And you had, some things were limited and you just didn't use long variable names. And I have a bad habit of WK1, work 1, work 2, IJK. And I have gotten away from that some, but there's still a fair amount of code kicking around that you go in and look at it and you say, shouldn't have done that, but okay, now I got to just search that code page for, okay, is there any other references here? Is that going to get me in trouble? Code names, the properties in the program, probably if you're pulling data out of a database, you should make them match always exactly. Don't pull stuff in that you're reading from the database and stuff it in some other property with some other name, and then you're down farther in the code and it's like, well, okay, what is this now? And it's just a simple little thing, but it's all about discipline. So if you do that, and some are staring like, well, I do that, so that's good. but there may have been a time you didn't do that, and you figured out why you shouldn't have. There's always a debate for me. I always like to put all the dims in the front because that way I can find them. It doesn't really matter so long as you do something consistent, but it does make it a challenge if you scatter them about in some random fashion among a block of code to be able to do that. I always use block ifs. If I have one statement, I always use block ifs because I like the visual impact of that when you're reading the code, and you can put white space around it and make it more visually appealing. So when you're scanning a long chunk of code and you want to see it, I think white space makes a difference, and block ifs seem to help that. I suppose if you didn't want to do that, that'd be okay too, as long as your eyeball can manage that. Consistent use of white space. I have this habit that I always, if I have a block if, I will put before the else or else if, there's a white line. There's a blank line before the else, so that the end of that block of logic sort of stands there with a little white space below it. So I personally find that useful because that way my eyes, when I'm scrolling a chunk of code, I can jump my eyes from it. The little bars on the side, they help some too, but that's just when I'm really lost because the end if is way off the bottom of the screen. So consistent use of that kind of stuff I think makes sense and makes it much more readable. The same in the method and class consistency. If you're doing some object-oriented stuff, Mark Strickland was talking about this morning, use the word class when you create your class. Just put it in there. So I do the same with property names. To give them something tagged on it that makes it, when you see it, you don't have to well, is that the string version or the integer version? Comments, and more comments. I do that. This is a habit from when I was doing data point assembler, and typically you would write a huge program, and I probably had more lines of comments than I had lines of executable code because it was so cryptic you just couldn't deal with it unless you had that many comments. So I do tend to do that. I've done that forever, and so sometimes I look back and it's like, did I really need to write that whole paragraph? But I did. Some more things. Object naming, we've talked about that. You just need to create your own method, though, that makes sense in object naming and in all of this. Don't be afraid of long names. Again, that's kind of a holdover from me from ancient programming habits. I didn't tend to do that until probably the last few years. Think about how the name might help you find it later. That could probably be something useful because that's sort of how all this got started. I was looking for things, and it's like, I should have been really more consistent with, even though the name is maybe long, doesn't apply to what I'm doing as well as it in context that it should. IDE folders. I do a lot in IDE folders when you're creating an app. I even, I do, the final app shouldn't have too many or too few, whatever kind of suits you, but IDE folders help, and you can categorize by a chunk of code that it applies to this functionality. It could apply that it is a certain type of, in a web app, it's all the dialogues go in here and all the web pages go in there, or whatever you want to do, whatever makes sense, but do it the same way all the time. And use group objects that match your style, so put things in the folder that make sense to you. And this is one probably everybody does, but break down code into modules or classes, and I have a habit of put code in a button and then I'll decide there needs to be more of it, and now it's time it should go someplace else. So you should really take the time and rip it out and stick it somewhere. If it goes more than one screen, you probably shouldn't be that much logic in a button. And you should break it down into whatever methods or classes or however you want to do it. I use constants a lot. I don't, when I'm coding things, I'll do a SQL statement, and I started off doing the line continuation underscore and all that. I don't do that anymore. And I will always create a constant and stick all this stuff in it. Even if I have to modify it, because sometimes I'll pull it out of the constant and I'll have a one or two search and replace parameters or something I have to do, and I will substitute those after I pull it out and stick it in a string variable. And it really makes the code much more readable, because sometimes, have you ever written one of those SQL statements that takes up a whole screen? I mean,
Oh, yeah.
they're just atrocious to try to do in the middle of code. So if you stuff them in a chunk of text in a constant, you can pull it in with one line of code. If you need to see the gory details, you just go get it out of the constant. One other cool trick is, though, but if it's in a constant, you can go copy and paste it into your query tool and run it. So you don't have to go take all the line continuation and the quotes and all the other junk out of it. You just pick it up and paste it into your SQL tool, and maybe you make a few little tweaks to it and run it. So it does make it much more efficient, because that's how I start all SQL statements. I go to the SQL query editor and get it to work the way I want, and then I paste that into a constant, and then fiddle with it if I need to make it make sense in the code. Don't sacrifice readability for compactness. I mean, everybody wants to write the ultimate Turing machine, if you remember that from computer science, that how few lines of code can you do so much work in? It certainly doesn't make it very maintainable. And things come out of Xojo not compact anyway. I mean, if you compare it to PowerBasic, the guy that founded PowerBasic he wrote the compiler and assembler. And he was always proud of how small the executables, they were ridiculously small. I mean, you could take a 300,000 line program and compile it into 1 meg in Windows. It was all Windows. So to make something a little less readable probably doesn't make much difference in Xojo with hardware today. So don't sacrifice that, because otherwise you're going to come back and wish you hadn't. And don't make reusable code the same thing. Don't make it too complex to understand. So sometimes it's better to just have two methods, even though they're kind of close, because you end up with such a tangled mess of ifs to make that one chunk of code work the way you want it. You'd been better off just with two pieces of it. Yeah, it does make some maintenance, but that's where your comments come in, and you can say, go see the other thing. If you're making changes to this module, you better make changes to that module so it matches. So again, that's a kind of a pragmatic thing. I guess if you really can deal at that level, well, you can make it pretty complicated. But somebody someday will pick up your piece of code and say, did this guy really work here? Notes and not comments in the ID. If you got something long, a paragraph to write, stick them in notes. Don't put it in comments. And so you open up a method, and the first screen is nothing but comments. You can reference the note and say, go see note so-and-so for the explanation of how this algorithm works. But stick it in notes, because that way you don't have to go look it up someplace else. It's inside the project. Source code control, that was a question. Why do you need it?
For the SQL tip you gave, what if there's variables for SQL?
Well, what I end up doing is sometimes, not always, but sometimes, if you put a token in your SQL in the constant, and then you load it into a variable, and then you do a replace. It's what I do. It's maybe not totally efficient. It depends on how frequently your SQL code, and you have to take into account if you need the dangers of getting old. You want to have SQL statements that are pre-compiled. What do you call that? Yeah. So, but the way I handle it most of the time, if I've got a big chunk of SQL code and I feel safe that it's okay to do it this way, and I need a token or two to substitute something, I will put a marker in there and a token with some brackets or something, my standard that I use, pull it into a string and do a search and replace with the actual variable substitution, and then you got an executable piece of SQL. So that's a technique. But again, it doesn't, this should be your technique, but that's one way to solve the problem of getting the SQL statements out of the middle of your code with line continuations and quotes and pluses and all that to concatenate a whole page of SQL code. So, source code control. In a one-person shop, you say you use Git and it works pretty good for you. That's good. I never have gotten thrilled with the command line interface. And I know there's GUIs you can wrap around it. I know Tower is one of them I looked at, and it's like, maybe. And so, but I finally hit upon another method that works for me. And I had for a long time, I just would make sure I had plenty of backups. And if I was really worried I'd make a backup, I would copy the project file. And I was using binary output from the saving things in binary. Of course, that doesn't give you really any granularity to any kind of source code control. It's a whole project or it's nothing. If you save in text, you do get some granularity. So, but if I was really worried, I would just go in the computer and duplicate the project file. Just right-click, duplicate. I could use a Mac, and that was easy. And so, if I really made a mess in the afternoon, I could at least get back to that duplicate. Not a great solution, but in a one-person shop, maybe okay. But then I sort of was motivated. I said I want to explore Git and see how it works, and I wasn't thrilled enough, and so I began to look for another method. But one of the things it does gives you beyond backup and recovery, suppose you want to go, you've made some changes, it was a week ago, and they're working okay, and then something happens, and you need to look at the code you had 3 weeks ago. Okay, you can restore the backup if you're using Apple Time Machine or whatever you use on Windows. You can restore the whole project, browse around, do whatever you want to do, and delete it. Copy, paste it in someplace else if you want. And that works. And if you have the personal discipline to keep track of all that, it's okay. I can't tell you how many times I've copied a project, though. It's laying in the directory on my Mac, and I've got 4 of them. And it's copy 1, copy 2, copy 3. And it's like, you can check the dates, maybe you can figure out what you're looking for, but the discipline was just not there to be consistent. I needed something more automatic. So if you're working in more than one person, I don't know how you possibly work on a Xojo project without some sort of source code control, or any project for that matter. But Xojo makes it even a little more problematical because everybody's going to pull the whole project up in the IDE and work on it. And so you got to be really careful you're not stepping on other things. So accidents can even happen that somebody stepped on your code, they made a change and didn't realize they weren't supposed to. So we talked about why backups are not the same, but it's better than nothing. And if you have the discipline, maybe it works for you. In a multi-person team, we talked about that. It is mandatory. But in a one-person team, I guess you could, in theory, be your own source code control and save your project and keep track of it and make backups or do like I was doing and duplicate. Or you could save it in text and sort the directory by date and copy the ones that changed out. You could do that. That just doesn't seem very practical. After a while, you'd be crazy. You need some sort of automated method that can capture every save. So what I ended up with, because I'm a Mac person, there's a product called ChronoSync that I have used for a long time for various things to sync my photo library that I use on USB disks to make sure that my primary library, my backup library, because I would never have just one, is in sync. And then I hit upon the idea that if you save the project in text, ChronoSync has a trigger option that when you change something in a file system, it can execute a ChronoSync project, and it will copy pieces and parts of what's changed. So what I use it for is I do a save in the IDE, and it shoots the one thing I was working on. ChronoSync picks it up, copies it, and so I do that all day long. I might have 50 versions of that same thing, and you can set the ChronoSync parameters so it keeps however many copies you want, however many days you want. So if you ever have a catastrophe, you go back to ChronoSync and dig through the archive and say, well, I want the one that was before lunch. The last one before lunch is the right one. And so you can then pull that one text module back. You do have to make the manual substitution in the right folder in the Xojo source code that you've got that you're saving in. And if you're clever, you rename something and save that one somewhere and put this one in its place and to double check. But for me, it makes it totally automatic. When I do it's the best of both worlds of backup and a source code control, because it is granular if you save in text format, not in binary format. It works in binary. Only problem is if you got a 40 meg project, it's got to copy 40 megs every time. So that's not very useful, especially if you're copying across a network. And ChronoSync has the ability to SFTP stuff, so you don't even, if you really want, you can have your offsite backup combined with your source code control and your backup all together. You can do the same thing in Windows with something called AJC Active Backup. It has the same, I have not used it in Xojo. It appears to have some of the same features, that it will monitor file system changes. So it is possible that you could probably configure that. Neither one of these are terribly expensive. So for me, in my MacGyver kind of the way I do things, ChronoSync is better than Git. If you want to come to Kentucky and spend a day or two and train me in Git, I might convert. I don't know. They have horses there. You can come during Derby, which is this coming weekend.
I'll have them into it.
Okay. You can look at all the people wearing their fanciest outfits.
What I do, manually, wherever I make a big change, I save the project, but to the name I add always this SQL date
Yeah.
with the time on it. So if I have to go back, I just have to go back to the last
Yeah, and he was saying that, I guess everybody hears that, we do have to repeat here, but that does make sense, and that's what I had done for many years, was just to duplicate it, add some attachment suffix to the name, and then that made sense so I could find it again, and then go back and use it. But then I guess I got lazy, and so when I realized, I already had ChronoSync, and I realized that it has forever updates for free, never have to pay for one, ever, no matter what they do to it. And I realized that it had this new feature a while back that said, monitor for file system changes, and then the kind of light bulb went on. And that's kind of what this talk is about. This should jog light bulb ideas in your head.
In a additive comment to his, this is how I do it in a one-man shop also. I just use save as and add a numerical index number and increment it with each save as. Now here's the advantage. If you change your GUI and you're just changing the width or height of an object or moving it, you know, you're going to have to go back through these ChronoSync files and just find a number that might just be 52 pixels instead of 54.
Yeah.
But if you just serialize your save as,
Yeah.
the whole project is there.
Yeah.
And you have multi-level backups, and then you clean out the old ones a few months
Yeah.
later.
You could do that. Are you saving binary?
No, I saved the project file.
Okay,
Now,
save.
the problem is it's bloated because it has all the extra information,
Yeah.
including your images. But guess what? I have enough drive space
Yeah.
for these files. And in a one-man shop, I can say, about 3 weeks ago, this thing's been broken for a couple weeks. Go back, and I'll find it, and I just have to do a save as, and add a index number higher than the one I
Right.
was using today,
Right.
and I'm back in business. And so this works too. And there's another utility that I know of only as backup. It's just I think it's called folder backup. But what it does is it just watches a folder for changes.
Yeah.
And it'll just send it to another drive to make a backup. So you can combine those techniques as well.
So again, you just need to find something personal.
ChronoSync is having a sale, 20% off, in case anyone's interested.
Who is?
ChronoSync.
Oh, okay. There you go. I don't have any. I don't get a discount. I don't know if you do.
All these solutions, are you able to do any kind of diff between these changes here? Versus
That's the missing piece. If you use a ChronoSync type solution, you could do it with a third-party tool though. You could go back to ChronoSync, go get your project parts in a certain date or time, stuff it in a folder, and then diff them somehow. You could do that. That would find your however many pixels changed when you did that change.
Got to use a similar method to that, renumber each new save. But Thomas Templeman's RBED, you can drag 2 files over and it'll highlight the changes between the two.
Yeah, that's true.
And
That's
if you
true.
go the free Notepad++ on Windows,
Yeah,
you've got a file comparison in that.
Right.
So drag the 2 text files in and it'll highlight, show you what's new in that, what's missing from this, all the way down the file.
probably not as elegant as maybe Git is, although Git's not very elegant in the front end. But all of this stuff works. The trick is to have the discipline to do your technique every single time and make sure it covers all your cases. Because the worst thing about doing your once a day nightly backup is you could lose a whole day's work. It could be 4 o'clock something really bad happens, and the best thing you got is to go back to yesterday. That's really bad. So maybe you end up with a hybrid method. So you end up with some sort of chronosync kind of thing, and then you do your trick. Yeah.
One other advantage of a new source control program like Git or SVN is you can comment what your change was.
Yeah.
And if you know there has been a problem for a few months, you can very fast scan it. It will be this change.
You can, because you know how to use Git.
Source tree is a really good
Source
wrapper
tree, yes.
around. Source tree,
Yeah,
What is?
source tree.
Oh, okay.
It makes it simple.
So, as Gino said, the thing that's about Git or any version control system for that matter is that, yes, Git can be intimidating in the beginning. However, there are other older but still reliable, like SVN. If you don't want to try Git because the commands are complicated and you have many ways of shooting yourself in the foot with Git, and there's conflicting advice on the internet on how to use it, just go with SVN. It'll work.
Okay.
It's reliable, it's simple, and it'll do. And if ever you want to switch to Git later because you feel more comfortable, then you can convert all your SVN stuff, including all your history, to Git. And I think you can do it the other way around too. But if you start with SVN, you'll be fine. And yes, it is older, but it's proven, and that's actually what Xojo uses.
I'm older.
And
It's okay.
There are GUI wrappers for SVN.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And
Yeah, there are.
yeah, multiple.
Yeah.
Subversions.
Subversion, yeah.
So, but again, some of this is discipline. If you just use it consistently.
The other comment that I want to make is, as a programmer, I'm a programmer because I'm lazy, right? I want to automate things as much as possible, and the things that I don't have to do manually, or the things that I have to do manually, I'm going to find a way to automate them as much as possible. The more I do things manually, whether they're manual or they're automated to a degree, that means that when I need to go back, I need to think, right, that was yesterday at noon, or that's all the mental load that you're adding.
Right.
The more I have of that, the less efficient the method is. If you use source control, any part of source control, you have comments that you're putting in yourself because you're in the moment. You said, I just did this, and it explains what you did, and then you just commit, you're done. It's gone from my mind. Of course, if your commit is always work in progress, well, that's not super useful. But it forces you, and all the metadata that you're looking for, the date, the time, that's all automatic, like it's taken care of. And the other super big advantage of version control is when you start doing releases.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
That's a big event. You would want to make a branch for that release so that then you can continue working on your master branch for all your new stuff, and your stable branches is there for the release. And if you have a bug fix that you have to make on the release because your client A says, hey, this button should be green and it was blue, well, you make it on your release branch, and you know that you're building from something that's solid, because it's not your master branch where you made all these changes that may change things. And the final thing is, even as a single person, continuous integration. If you have a machine that does nothing but builds for you, and those are the builds that always come out that you send to your clients, it also means that not only you can make this with your personal laptop that may or may not have the software that you need, but you have this very stable build environment that does the builds for you. You can do this with a sync method like this, but all the CI systems are really built for version control. It'll just make builds for you. It'll run your tests for you. You don't even have to do unit tests. If you just want to do builds, we all do builds. We ship software. Let another machine do it, and that gives you confidence that what you're building is always the same thing. It's not just a random thing that I install using brew, get, whatever, you know?
Yeah, and I would agree. I mean, you really, to be that level of formality, when I looked at Git, though, I said, this is probably going to make it worse instead of better until I get to the point that I'm pretty fluent. And I think you said earlier, you can shoot your foot off with Git and not even know it until it's too late. So, and I think that's true with any of these methods. The bottom bullet up there, no matter what method you use, whether it's put a serial number on the end or chronosync or Git or SVN, you should test it. It's never about the backup that's the problem. It's always the restore. So you need to go actually break something, actually do whatever you need to do to save it in your method of source code control, and then try to get back to it.
And if your restore method has lots of manual steps, you're more likely to make a mistake.
Yes. Yeah. So, yeah, I agree.
At
So.
the moment that you want it released, right?
Right.
You're like panicking, oh my God, something's bad, right?
So, but I guess how many people use formal source code control here? Okay, half the room maybe. I think Xojo probably, it's a little more, I mean, it's a different crowd than you might have for everybody who was in their 20s. That would be forced to, they went ahead and learned Git and it all works, and that's just a way of life.
Oh, there's a bunch of 20-year-olds that don't use Git. Don't
Oh, I know, I agree. That's probably true. Other little things that I have sort of picked up, you might, think about. How to stay focused in the code. Obviously, things, if you're working on a section, you can keep them in tabs and do things like that. I put comments in that I intend to use just for searches. Nothing but a search, and I format it a very certain way with some delimiters. And when I am looking for something, especially when I'm working on 2 or 3 parts of the code and it's scattered in different parts of the project, but it's all the same kind of functionality, I will go in and make sure that there's comments that all match before I start. And they're just temporary. And I may take them out later. I may not. But it lets me, I can go to the nice little search thingy on the bottom of the Xojo IDE, type in my search word that might be written on a sticky note on my desk, and I type that in, and lo and behold, I have all the pieces, because there's a comment in every module, every whatever, that I can go find, and so I can just go touch the first one, go to it, touch the second one, go to it, touch the third one, and when I'm finally satisfied I don't have to work on it anymore, I might go take them all out. Maybe not, but it made it was sort of a...
So essentially like bookmarks.
It was a poor man's bookmark, but it was my personal way to do that. And it was as flexible as I wanted it to be. And sometimes I will leave the permanent comments in there to connect things that don't seem intuitively obviously connected. But I have sort of a technique for doing those comments with a certain form of delimiters and things, so you don't get false positives by turning up things that don't belong. So I find that pretty handy. It helps compensate for the fact that some of the module and screen and web page naming isn't quite as consistent as it should be, and now it's just too darn much trouble to change some of that. Sometimes I'll use temporary folders in the IDE. I'll just create a folder, and I'll just put stuff in there I'm working on, and it'll all be together. And then when I'm done, and I know I'm not going to work on it anymore, I'll put it back where it belongs. That way, when I open up the project over 3 or 4 days, that's a folder I want to work on. And so I'll do that, and then just drag and drop them back where they belong. If you have a method of where you put, web pages in those folders and dialogues in this, or however you want to do it. There's more? Yeah, you should learn all about the IDE tools. I was intrigued by what we saw in the keynote, that the new interface, that has some promise to be able to make coding a little easier. But there's stuff in there that some people probably do or don't use. It wasn't too long ago that I finally came up and I said, I'm tired of doing these changes to compile this thing. I had some code, and I had a version compiled for different customers, essentially. And I would have to make a couple of tweaks. Most of the stuff was database driven. The name of the customer and some other stuff came out of the database. But when I was testing, I had port numbers and other stuff because I would launch it on the server as a standalone. And I had port numbers, and I'd have to always remember. And you gotta have different, there were a couple of things that related. And so I just said, okay, I'm gonna learn how to use IDE scripts. I had never used them before, so I sat down and learned how to use that. And it's like, oh great, this is easy. Find the script, run it, okay, done, compile. Do the other one, compile, done. And it just made it so easy, because part of the other problem was it had to change the executable name and stuff like that. So it was like 4 or 5 little trivial changes that you'd do 3 of the 4, and then it wouldn't compile right, and then you'd have to go fix it. So that was helpful. The Ide Filter, I guess, seems to work pretty good. That's up at the top above the Object Explorer. Although I can't say I'm thrilled with that, but it, figure out how to use that if you don't use it. You ought to take time to learn a new IDE feature. If there's stuff you kept seeing in there, you don't know how to do it, and you should probably take the time to once a week, once a month or something, like, I'm going to learn that today, and take an hour and dig through it, and if it doesn't do anything nice and useful, just throw that one out of your brain. If it does, then you can file it away, and that can be something you can use in your toolkit. All of this is around discipline, whether you're using Git or whether you're naming objects or whether you're doing whatever. It's about discipline. So, you need to create and document your own strategy. Doesn't need to be too deep. Heck, you put it inside the project for that matter if you want it in a note. Be consistent even when it seems like more work. Is it faster to do it twice when you have to fix it? Be your own personal trainer. That's what discipline is. You go to the gym. I don't go to the gym, but you go to the gym, and sometimes it's handy to have that personal trainer that, okay, I'm embarrassed. I've actually got to have to do this before I get there. I'll have to tell him I walked 5 miles, and I really have to do it because he'll be able to tell after 3 weeks that I haven't been doing it. So the personal trainer, the problem is in this environment, you don't really have a personal trainer. It's just, it's about the motivation. So, you have to be your own personal trainer. And that's the end. So, questions? Any more questions? Maybe not?
You said that you put lots of comments, which is a good idea. What's your strategy for preventing those comments from being stale as you change the code?
Being stale? The previous slide. So, I guess I have, because of my background that I came from this data point assembler background, I just had a discipline to do a lot of commenting. And so the trick should be, if you're doing a major overhaul, you better have a plan, and changing the comments should be as part of the plan as well as changing the logic in the whatever. So, and it still happens anyway. But my personal discipline is, because I'm a comment-oriented guy, I tend to look at the comments. And I'm also old, and so when I go back to revisit code, it doesn't take too many weeks or days before it's like, what was I trying to do here? So I'm forced to read them.
Nothing to do with age.
Oh, it doesn't? Okay.
It does not. Guaranteed.
Well, it gets worse when you get older.
But old is back to IBM 360 assembler language.
Okay. I didn't do any of that.
That's where I cut my teeth.
I think the data point was in the same vintage, though. Go ahead.
70s. That was in the 70s.
Mark, you didn't specifically talk about refactoring code, but I find it's really helpful not only to get rid of stale comments, but to break things into usable routines.
Yeah.
We tend to get bloated code and it's running and it's working. But I force myself as part of my discipline to refactor that code and find the essential blocks and move them into other routines.
And make modules or methods or whatever.
Well, it could be, you can place the refactor code in the same class if you wish.
Yeah.
That's not really the issue. It forces you to get rid of these archaic comments, because when you refactor it, you create a method and then you comment it at that time. And that tends to stand up longer and get less stale than leaving a large block. You mentioned nested if statements, for
Right.
example. That's a classic example. That needs to be refactored. And when you do that, you learn that your code might actually not be working the way you thought it would.
Yes, that's happened.
And you're looking at it and you go, I didn't have a case for that, for this other thing. And so it's partly a debugging tool and partly an organizational tool, but once you modulize things better, it stays cleaner longer too.
Well, and maybe that's part of your discipline in your...
You have to sit down sometimes when it's working and say, I just have to go through this one more time and break some of these big routines into small routines. That really helps clean code.
So maybe that's part of your discipline. Not only you have to learn a new IDE feature, until you run out of stuff to look at, but you have a refactoring that you're always going in and you're looking.
The reason this works, this is a truism that I use all the time, is that code is mostly read and not written.
Yes.
And what I use for myself is that past Phil is an idiot, current Phil is a decent programmer, future Phil is a genius. So when you're looking at that old code that you're refactoring, you're looking at past Phil was an idiot, let's fix that to make it better. And then you make it better because you're a decent programmer. Right? That's the idea. That's why this works.
The code may still be running properly.
Yeah.
There are some pearls in there when you refactor it.
Yes,
Yeah.
absolutely.
It actually does.
Because they were written by
Well, and the refactoring can be the same. It's, it's like taking the old kludged up dialog box you had that's getting replaced with Graffiti Suite pop-up alerts or something like that. But maybe that should be part of your strategy that says once a week, once a month, I need to find something that needs refactoring and just take the time to go do it. And
code that is about 5 screens long.
Yes.
That's a dead giveaway
Yep.
of inefficient, complex code that is hard to debug and has probably a lot of bugs in it.
And it'll run faster after you refactor it. Really, the parser has to go through a long and create a lot of subroutines out of that and stuff. You'll break it into smaller routines that run fast.
yeah. So, but again, it's discipline, because if you just say, I'm tired, I'm not going to do that anymore because I got the bug out of it and we're moving on. And so, and pressure happens. I mean, you need to make money. You need customers to beat on your head for the new feature that they want, that you don't have time for, but you end up working on it when you should have been back there cleaning up something. So it's, you got to be your own personal trainer. Who is it? You just look at yourself and take a new role and say, okay, if I had an assistant that was my personal trainer, what would they tell me to do today? And then decide that that's a priority, and if you can manage it, go do it. So, I mean, a lot of all this, there's a million ways to write a program. And so it's just, you need to find something that works with yourself, with your own style. So I'll probably stick to ChronoSync. Maybe I'll check out SVN.
I hope you do. The other small comment that I have was you mentioned if you put some logic into the button handlers, and if it's more than a page long, it's probably too long. In my impression, if it's more than one line, it's
Okay.
probably too long.
Okay.
I agree completely on that.
Yeah, again, that's probably some of that's personal preference, but I agree from a readability point of view.
It's not just readability, it's everything else. It's all this stuff that understanding later.
Well, again, it's somehow how your brain functions, but and if you're working with people in a group, it should be how everybody's brain functions, I suppose. But I'm not very object oriented as a developer. I mean, although you don't have to use objects to have it, you can just use a plain old method and stick one line of code in a button. But some of it is things that make you really comfortable in the way you do things, and so long as it doesn't cause problems. There's a million ways to solve it. But if you get anywhere between one and one screenful, anywhere than 2 lines or one screenful, you're probably approaching your limit on a button.
I will also say in response to Phil's comment, if you're using the same logic in 2 different places, it's time to break it out and put a method up.
Yeah, for sure.
That's for maintenance, code maintenance.
Yeah.
Future proofing. And you do this commonly with buttons and controls. You put add row or open window or something, and you're doing it in several places. And you should actually figure out that logic and put it in a central place. Because otherwise you'll have spaghetti and you'll be looking for the one that broke.
Right.
I mean, you say that between 2 lines and a screenful. I contend that anything you want to do in a button, you can do in 1 line. I think that if you put one, there's nothing you can't do that you could do in 1 line. Because you're going to call a helper method, an object, or whatever. It's going to be 1 line, guaranteed. There's nothing that's specific to the button that you really need. If you really need that thing, you would pass it as a parameter to the functioning polygon. Exactly.
Yeah. The only other reason though you wouldn't pull out, you got 2 methods and 2 buttons that are almost identical, would be if combining those created spaghetti logic in itself. It can, because you have enough dissimilarities. And for me, the pragmatic side of me says, if it's really going to confuse me later, I'll just make 2 methods. If it's really going to confuse me, because it will create this ugly block if nested thing, and then I don't do it.
That's what you do want to avoid. That's why refactoring, you
Yeah.
go back in, you go, look what I did. This won't
got
work.
2 ifs, yeah.
It's got 5 ifs because I tried to make one method to handle 12 different buttons.
Right.
That isn't correct.
And then you don't combine them because having 2
Then you
makes more
make
sense.
An object, and this object responds to different messages.
Yes.
And
Yeah. Good. Great talk.
Thanks.
Yeah.